I'm very happy to be here today. I spend a lot of time in the standards organizations for the broadcast industry, especially through ITU and other groups. So this event is one that I know has a lot of impact. I'm going to take you on I'll try to avoid, maybe that's, I don't know if that's from there. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of things I've been thinking about, some in different forms, but feel free to save some questions. And where is that coming from? Do you, pardon? Or the feedback. Before I start, I want to make sure hello? Hello. Okay, all right. You're all good? If you hear feedback, raise your hand because I might not hear it and you're hearing feedback still. Okay. Maybe take me down a little bit. I'll try to speak a little louder. Is that okay? Is that better? Yeah? Okay. We'll go with that. And again, raise your hand if you start to hear something, because I'd rather you take me down and I start yelling than you have to put up with feedback. Okay. All right. What do you think of when you see this image? Like, what comes to mind?
Blue marble.
What?
Blue marble.
Blue marble. All right. Anything? Home. Okay. So, yes. There may be other homes too. Climate change, maybe planet. It depends who I talk to, but there's a lot of similarity in the things that might come to mind for people in this room, or maybe not. Well, I was in, I'll tell you a story. It was last year, and I was here for another event I was speaking at, and I had my 2.5-year-old daughter with me, and we went to the Smithsonian, we went to the planetarium. And she's 2.5. We're watching a film that they're about to show called Journey to the Sun. And as you do in many planetariums, they always do this, you start on Earth and you do this big pan out where suddenly it looks a lot like this image as we're about to travel into space. Everything's completely quiet. And my daughter yells as loud as she could, "Whoa, I am not getting any, this is, okay." But I just want to make sure, I'm going to need to, okay. And my daughter yells as loud as she could, "Minions." Which, you might wonder why. Why would she do that? What's coming to mind? Why is her experience of the image that we know as Earth causing her to think of little yellow creatures? Well, it makes a lot of sense when you realize her experientially established prior of this image is coming from this image. So as far as she knows, what I love about this though is, how it's a great example of how we all have very different mental representations and internal experiences of the exact same content. And this isn't just one example. This happens all the time in the world. This is really fundamental to how we have to think about the content that we create, the experiences, the tools we build, and how they reach the people that are, consuming them. As humans or any creatures, our brains in evolution are constantly working to help us solve problems. Those problems come down to 3 core things. We have to eat, we have to mate, we have to be able to communicate. Everything we do around there is somehow fitting into that piece of the puzzle. And much of what our brain does is help us make sense of a world that doesn't actually have us experience the world as it is. We all experience it a little bit differently depending on our priors, depending on the differences in our underlying biology, our experiential priors, the probabilistic. Okay, this is going to be a problem. The probabilistic. How about can you sit there and when I go like this, make sure that the slide advances? If I go like this really, really big, it means definitely move it forward. All right, the probabilistic nature, we can describe, how we behaviorally integrate information from the environment has been well described with Bayesian integration. But it's this probabilistic nature of how we make sense of the learnings, the statistical distributions of our environments that influence how we each experience the exact same piece of information very differently. In fact, I'm going to go back on that one. In fact, whether where you grew up, the types of information in those environments, say whether you grew up in a village in Afghanistan, a town in the Midwest, a city like New York or DC or Kathmandu. Every one of these environments is unique. And it's unique in ways that you might not think about. In the colors, the contours, the shapes, the environmental pressures that are putting pressure on your evolutionary ability to be successful in those environments. And when you're in a city, the auditory information of what your brain has to solve for scene analysis is very different than when you grow up in the plains. And your brain adjusts. That's all about plasticity. The statistical nature, the distributions of color and contour, and even noise influence your brain, and they influence how your neural sensitivities will adjust to make you successful in those environments. You can look at the noise distributions of cities and towns around the world and be able to understand and see very predictable differences in how people hear, their underlying biology based on whether I'm in India, I'm in New York, or I'm in a different city in the United States that might have a very different noise floor. All of these things affect your demographics, but they are changing your biology, and ultimately they're changing how you experience the content around you. Now, my background, I've been in technology for a number of years, and that's really what I think about is, how is technology going to shape us in the future, and what technology should we be building and putting in place to enable the ecosystems we want to see and we want to have evolving us towards the future that we want to proactively write. But my background, before I came to Dolby, I was research faculty in the biomedical engineering department in a med school at Hopkins, and that world was called systems neuroscience. That's what I defined myself as. And and the problems that we thought about were, how do you understand and predict data transfer, coding, and information optimization in the neural pathways, okay? That might sound like something you don't need to think about, or it's not relevant to what you do, but in fact, I'd say it's the exact same thing. Maybe with a slight change and a slight metaphoric tinge there, but what was my goal? What was our goal? Our goal was to understand how the brain took in information, how it translated, because we don't experience the world as it is. We experience a very different perceptual reality, and hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll be thinking about this more richly. But we care about, as we go from the world as it is, which I like to call the content side, what happens in the production and delivery pathway through our physiological system or through a system that we're trying to transport information. What happens in that what do we need to do to enable the right dimensionality reductions that happen in that pathway? What matters? What kind of artifacts appear when we do those dimensionality reductions? And what types of coding strategies can we use? What kind of coding strategies does the brain use? The more we learned about that, the more we understood the brain's efficiencies and where we could push, where we could stretch, and what we could do to make the most sense and augment experiences and predict what they would be like as richly as possible. So to me, there were a lot of similarities. But right now, this is what I care about, is, are we capturing the right dimensions to preserve and transmit the intent of the creator? We might be talking about the brain, but when you think about the creation pathway, what really matters to assure that that transmission has the fidelity of experience that we wanted to start with. Sorry. What's happening? Oh, thank you. Sorry. I actually did a puzzle hunt, and we ended up on the Intrepid at 2 a.m. having to solve puzzles on an enigma, which I thought was a very cool thing to get to do. So if any of you like doing solving cryptic puzzles, it can be a fun thing. But so have we captured that transmission from the creator? So here are sort of three main themes of what we want to think about is, do we have the right code in what we care about to preserve the creation intent of future experiences? Can new technologies change how we think about preserving the experience of our media? And if in the future, content consumption environments close the loop, and when I say close the loop, that's what I'm going to be talking a lot about, between our media and our human response, because that's happening right now. There is ubiquitous sensing everywhere. And the future that I want you to think about is a future where you know what your receiver is understanding. You know what they're feeling. You don't just know where they are. You're going to know where they are. You're going to know what their context is, how that context is changing, the environment that they're consuming that content in, and how they're reacting to it. So if we make that assumption that loop is going to start getting closed for much technology of the future, what does that mean? And are we ready? All right, so what do I mean creator's intent? And this is just, I've got some different examples in here, and these are just how I like to set some things up, but everyone knows this is Monet's water lilies, okay? Monet, one thing, this was my own sleuthing to figure this out, but if you've ever looked at Monet through Monet, sorry, I'm terrible with my French accents, but if you've ever looked at Monet through one eye, you'll notice something, perhaps. I know the resolution on this projector is not as high as we would like, but if you look at it through one eye, you might notice that you'll experience more three-dimensional pop-out of the lilies of information in the scene. So go ahead and cover one eye and look at it. Does anyone notice that? Yeah, so next time you're at the MoMA or something, you'll do this. I do this to try to understand what the internal experiences of the artist might be, because often great art, great creation comes from when you have a reason to compensate for something else. So in this case, my hypothesis was that Monet did not have good stereoscopic vision, or let's say his brain could not make use of the stereoscopic information coming from two eyes to be able to use that in how his brain resolved depth perception, okay? So, you know, we all, for the most part, make use of binocular vision in how we identify where objects are in depth. But in fact, Monet had, when I went and started looking through his medical, what was visible about his medical records, had cataracts. And he had, especially when he was painting water lilies, his cataracts were so bad he had one cataract removed and not the other. And this was at a time where they did not replace it with a synthetic lens. So clearly, there was no way Monet was making use of his stereoscopic visual cues. Now, what happens then is his brain will adjust. Your brain's like incredibly plastic, so don't always know that when one thing goes bad, your brain's going to do all sorts of amazing things to compensate for that and to help you have superpowers on some other dimension. And that's what happened to Monet, is where, you know, his brain became very good at capturing monocular, well, we all can capture information from monocular depth cues, but how he could interpret that in two dimensions became some very sophisticated. Things like occlusion, shading, you know, became very effective for him. But then when you think about what is the intent, how did Monet actually experience that painting? Or when he painted it, what was his intent? And I would say that actually when you experience it with one eye, that's probably more close to what the creator's intent was of this image. Okay? I'm not saying you should watch your content with one eye closed, but hopefully you get my idea, where if you actually are trying to think about what is that translation, this is one place where it might be. So I have a few large themes. That one is what I call empathetic technology is going to transform the relationship we have with the spaces where we work, where we live, where we train. And empathetic technology, when I say that word, it doesn't mean, we're not talking about technology, AI that empathizes with us. This is instead the idea that technology, ubiquitous sensing, the amalgamation of sensors paired with machine learning in our environments, on us, around us, not even contact, but knowing information about our internal states, that will become a critical interface for how our technology is taking our internal success of an experience into the interface of how that technology makes decisions or behaves. Okay? It's not about, I need technology to empathize with me. It's my technology has some input about how I might be experiencing the information that's being transmitted to me. Is that differentiation clear? All right, so, and then the second thing is that one size fits all technology will become a thing of the past. Yeah. Right now, we have been very much in a history of information. We build technologies and we transmit them to extremely heterogeneous demographics, individuals, geographies. And we're going to start seeing more and more places where we have what I call personalization and contextual optimization become critical inputs to how content, how our technologies react and behave. And when I think about ways that might happen, this is one aside example. So for many of you may be familiar with our Dolby's audio, object-based audio. Any object-based audio today captures information in metadata. And in our cinema, when we introduced Atmos about 7 years ago, one of the key shifts that we made was going from a channel-based system where our sound was all mixed together to a less, moving away from a one-size-fits-all solution towards an opportunity, a moment where now sound came with a data stream. That data stream is, to me, very simplistic at this point in time to what it will be in the future. Right now, the 128 objects that's introduced can be captured with, it comes with spatial metadata that tells you X, Y, Z coordinates, where it should be. It tells you the size it should be, perceived, how wide it should be, how much of that's the space it's being represented in, how much it should take up. It tells you how diffuse that experience should be of the sound. Right? Those are all very descriptive and objective parameters that are modified dependent on the context of where the information is being consumed. In a not so far future, I would like to see information, like I might say perceptual or physiological data-driven model information, things about personalization when someone's consuming something individually, robust and consistent individualization. You might see something like a head-related transfer function, things like that get integrated into the metadata that gets moved, but less about broadcast. But here's something that I think is really relevant, which is intent. What about creators' intent? You can imagine a very near future where the authored track, there's authored metadata by a creator that captures emotion, captures the trajectory of what the content they're creating should elicit in their audience, okay? And you can know that, but you can also know whether it's actually achieved. Because ultimately what you want to have is not, art is subjective, and I'll talk about that a little more, but ultimately what you want to assure is that the dimensions that are translated aren't just pixels and bits, they're also the intent, because we take experiences from the cinema and we care about that experience being scaled across mobile devices, across displays, across any context and environment that we don't always have control over, but we will know, because that information will be captured in the future through sensors, through information. This dynamic interaction is going to exist. It's already existing. So with that, I have 3 key beliefs that I subscribe to, but I think are important to think about the future of how human and AI sensory technology development will happen. One, that our experiential technologies need to consider what I like to call a holistic human sensory experience. We have to recognize that what we see and what we hear interact together, and also create an experience that we can capture of an internal success of an emotion, of a content. The experience is malleable. How we experience content, how we experience information can be modified by our context, by our expectations, by the information that precedes or follows. I'll give some examples of that in a moment. But it is predictable. Because if it's not predictable, there's no point in trying to build it, right? So what we want to be able to do is figure out more and more the right information, the right controls, the right pieces that need to go into those probabilistic models to enable technology to make better decisions for how it optimizes our information to an individual. And that technology development will benefit from tracking and interacting with both the perceptual and physiological state of the user. And the computational capability will become more and more feasible. So 10 years ago, talking about closed loop technology that knows something about the individual to drive, well, it wasn't really conceptually tractable, because it was just the computational complexity, the ubiquity of sensors and environment, the costs was all the problem. But today, and I'll show you some examples, the amalgamation of even consumer grade sensors around us paired with the reduction in silicon size to support really sophisticated machine learning and AI computation, that amalgamation of sensors in our environment that enable us to integrate information from different sensors enables a very sophisticated interaction of an understanding of our scenes, of the context where we're capturing information and experiencing it, and the internal experience of a user. So to get there, I like to say, okay, these are the things we've got to care about. We have to care about control, insight, and then that feeds into creation. Okay? And all of these we're using to ultimately do three things, which is predict and optimize our perception. We need to know what people experience when they experience a technology, and specifically certain content through that technology. We have to be able to predict what that experience will be, because it's not exactly as the content is. It's going to change given a lot of different parameters that are potentially out of our control. We want dimensionality reduction. That means, for me, it's, we've got a really complex, well, let's say also not scalable experience that we want to somehow transmit and make as effective as possible, that the critical dimensions, which I would say emotion and experience are a really important one to be considering, are not lost and not compromised. And then finally, we want to scale and optimize our experiences as effectively as possible given those contexts. So here's an example of what I mean by control. It's just a fun one. I want you all to look up. You're going to see some bubbles floating up on the screen, and I want you to look up at the sunlight. The sunlight will be off in the corner. So just look at the sunlight while you're watching the bubbles, and I'll ask you a few questions. All right, so you probably all see some bubbles. They're rising. You might see them. They seem to sort of fly off the screen at an angle. Is that right? Yes? Nod? Okay, now I want you to shift your gaze directly to the bubbles. All right, so I built this illusion, and I did it because there are a couple of things. It's exploiting. Now you can shift back to the sunlight. I'm telling you, you now know the bubbles are going straight up, but guess what? You look back at the sunlight and you can't choose to see them going straight up. This isn't something about how I attend or do I know or not know. I'm tricking you. This is about underlying your neural processing and what you experience in the world every day. So what's going on here very quickly, you've got conflicting trajectories of motion. You've got bubbles with horizontal gratings moving across, and then they're moving up vertically, right? And when you are foveated on them, when your gaze is directed at them, your brain can separate these two different conflicting motion trajectories, and you experience both as they are. We would say that's a veridical experience of the motion trajectories. But then, when you look up at the sunlight, now the bubbles fall in your periphery. And guess what? Your brain does something else. Your brain integrates information from both trajectories, and you experience them moving off at an angle. That's not wrong. Everyone experiences it. This is what your brain does to solve the problem. Just because it isn't the way the world is, it is definitely how you experience that content and how everyone experiences some degree of that content. But here's the problem. If I don't know where you're looking, I don't know what your mental or internal experience of this information is, right? So you can go back and forth, and I've lost a critical piece of information. But the minute this is just one example, introduce an eye tracker or some sort of ubiquitous way of knowing where your gaze is directed, I gain great insight to differentiate one from the other, and moreover to potentially feed how I'm algorithmically driving my content. In one case, I need to have higher, if I wanted to do some sort of optimized rendering or foveated control of data reduction, I can do that based on knowing that piece of information, because I know perceptually that you have very different experience and that certain pieces of information you don't actually experience in the same way dependent on where your eyes are tracking. But this is just an example of how closing the loop gives me a great deal of insight about my user experience that is otherwise ambiguous. Now, we can go to another side. So in closing the loop, the big part then is, how do we gain insight? How do we gain insight to that internal experience that enables us to make predictions about the future? and predictions about the future of a user, how a user is behaving, reacting. Because one thing, I'll give a few examples, and this is a bit of a tour through, just for curiosity, how many people are pretty familiar with what we can capture from non-contact sensing and internal experiences today? A few? Yeah, I'm sure. So think of this as a sort of walk through some of the ways we look at things, and the richness of different biometric signals, in some case on body, in some case just in your environment, that all are consumer grade things that you could imagine being in any display, any room, and they'll be on people's bodies, or they'll be in their environments in a very near future. Now, what we do with that insight is critical. Let me take an example here. So this is it's obviously a time series. I'll tell you it's a biological signal. Question is, in fact, it's what we call galvanic skin response. So there's another name for a galvanic skin response. Does anyone know what it is? Absolutely, it's a lie detector too. Same sort of thing, but what you're doing is, so we happen to have a sensor. You can do this probably non-contact as well, looking at certain specularity changes in skin. But in this case, we're measuring conductance change on someone's skin in response to some content. The question is, what are they? So they're watching something. What do you think they're watching? There you go. Yes. So they're watching penalty kicks. And there are a couple of pieces of this that I think are really beautiful. One is, so the person who was watching this was not a soccer fan at all, really, and they actually, had no emotional, care about these matches. But there is a human anticipatory response that you can't shut down, that we could perfectly predict where every one of those penalty kicks was just looking at this signal, because that's what your body does, right? And the way I think about it is, what we're trying to do is, one, assure that we know these things, but assure that the technology and the translation of content enables these same sort of physiological responses, because that really tells you when that emotional intent is being captured. So here's another example, and I think this is an important one. Your eye gives away what I like to say is your poker face. Your eye responds to how hard your brain is working, how engaged you are. We can capture this. We're able to now, the ubiquity of sensors, they're going, any AR device in the future will obviously have eye tracking, but you can capture a lot of this. These are with consumer grade sensors that are available and very cost efficient. But what I want you to realize is the fact that your eye captures how hard your brain is working is this incredibly rich piece of information. So I want you to watch the pupil. And at first, try to understand the two talkers that you're listening to. And at first, it's going to seem hard, and then it should get easy because one of the talkers is going to drop out. And the important part is you're going to see how hard, you're going to see the change in the diameter of the pupil. And I promise your eyes are doing the same thing as the subject in our lab here. Okay.
Intelligent technology depends on personal data. Intelligent technology depends on personal data. Intelligent technology depends on personal data. Intelligent technology depends on personal data.
Okay, so so your autonomic nervous system is driving your eye to dilate. It's driving your eye to dilate when your brain's having to work harder, and then it contracts when it's not. We've used these techniques in labs for many years, but what's changed is this is now a device that not only, so here's an example. I mean, we can track it in two cases, where in one it's single talker, dual talker. We can raise the signal to noise ratio of the dialogue, and you'll get a reduction in dilation. Or we could spatialize audio, because guess what? That greatly increases the ability to hear content, as well as reducing what we call cognitive load, which is a really critical part of having successful experience of any content. And these experiences now are not something that just stay in the lab. The ability to capture this information is really quite trivial. I won't say it's trivial, it's not trivial. But in terms of the processing that needs to go on behind it, but in terms of the ubiquity where these things can be, where you can, how easy it is to capture a pupil in these ways, quite prevalent. You know, so an example here, everyone in this room is quite familiar with Dolby AC4 and some of the other technologies that include dialogue enhancement for for ATSC3. You could imagine very reasonably driving dialogue enhancement. Say you're watching a basketball game in a noisy environment, and you have, you know, the camera on your display is picking up, you're trying to hear the dialogue of the announcer, everybody's talking around you, the camera on the display is picking up the dilation of your pupil and enhancing the dialogue by using that as a closed loop interface. You know, that's something that we can build now and actually does work. But the question is, you know, what does this look like in the future? Because, you know, what I like about many of these approaches is they recognize that we all have different experiences of content, and we all have different points, and often the difficult part is, where do you engage? How do you engage? How do you do you pull up, how do you know what the right experience is? And using internal state for something like, say, cognitive load, I think everyone wants to reduce cognitive load and increase engagement for content. That's a really it's a really obvious place where we want to improve the experiences that people have. So another way that we can look at internal experiences came about, and this is an anecdote I've been telling for some time, but it's really powerful to me. I joined my company about 8.5 years ago, and it was at the time where we were in early development of some of our imaging technologies. But one of the pieces of content that we had, and everyone who knows, I think, my company as well as others, we care a lot about high dynamic range imaging, where you had previous displays were around 300 candelas per square meter, and we were working in this case with research devices that let us get up to 20,000 nits or candelas per square meter, and higher contrast, higher luminance, as well as wider color gamut. But the real thing that changed for me how we needed to think about what immersive technologies should be, or how we should care about them, was from some experiences in the early days of our HDR development. So we're watching this piece of fire content, and it was really actually odd piece of content. It's like man with a whip and fire dancing, perhaps it's showing up somewhere here. But I was watching the whip of fire come out, he goes like this, and my face reacted. Okay, I felt a physiological change, and I'm a physiologist by training, so these things hit me, and I have to wonder why, what happened. And my initial reaction was, okay, the display is giving off heat, because obviously that happens, right? I think everyone knows that. You expect there's this big specular highlight in the middle of the screen, the display. That's probably what's happening, and I'm feeling that. So the right answer is not, let's ask people what you think, whether you feel heat. That's subjective. I don't want to do anything about that. I want to know whether it's actually changing. Is the display constant? I talked to one of our core developers, Marty Richards, some of you may know him, and he's like, no, should be constant. All right, so get out a thermal camera. I got out a thermal imaging camera and track it. And in fact, the display, I'll go back to this, display was completely constant. But then what we did was we could actually track regions on people's cheeks in response to the fire content, in response to the flame at changing levels of HDR, of luminance. And we could hit a level where it would go away, and we could hit levels at which it started to saturate. So this was very insightful to me. Again, it affected a couple of things. So you have content-dependent reactions on physiology of people consuming this content and experiencing these technologies, which gets to, it affected a couple ways of how I wanted us thinking about information in our and development in our company, with one being, look, this was great on a basic science level, because I don't think anyone had shown this before, where, you know, we are probabilistic creatures that wander the world and have experiences, much as I've been talking about in the last 20 minutes. But in this case, when we, you know, just based on the luminance reaching my retina and my knowledge that it was flame, my body was reacting, because it's like I've never experienced fire that wasn't real, that was that bright. And so I'm going to have a physiological reaction to it. And it also tells us that when you're out in the wild, independent of the displays that we're creating, you see fire, your body's already reacting to it before it even feels it, just based on how your eye, the information to your visual system, is interacting with the content around you, which is pretty crazy, but makes complete sense, because that's efficient, right? That's much more optimized than waiting till it's too hot and your body hasn't started giving you off heat to, you know, enable you to interact with it. So that was great, but then it also really changed to me how I want my company thinking about what an immersive technology should be. It's that authentic interaction with our bodies that we're trying to hit in these cases, and we're trying to capture. Now, we went from here, and the thermal signature on its own is actually extremely rich, because it turns out we radiate. You know, the IR, I'm showing you this is all, you know, IR captured of the physiological changes happening in our bodies, but we actually radiate information about our internal experiences. Things like we can look at the derivatives of changes happening in your face and know whether you're experiencing cognitive load, whether you're experiencing stress, whether you're actually engaged in the information that we're trying to present to you. And I think it became, you know, and this is all through non-contact sensing. This is something that, you know, I like to say, perhaps in the future, you know, your thermal response becomes some part of how we socially interact with each other and know, you know, and interpersonal interest. That's a maybe fanciful future of AR, but this is all trying to get you to realize that whether we like it or not, we all have these deterministic ways that we communicate with our technology in our spaces. And in the future, those things will become even more prevalent. Obviously, transparency to how we engage with our technologies is going to become a very critical part in how we regulate and protect against them. It's something I talk about a lot. I'm not talking about that. I do think about it. Privacy is very key to my beliefs, so I want to make sure that you all recognize that this is not something I think should be done without someone agreeing to want to be captured. But so sensors track our internal states, predicting and anticipating our experiences. You know, this is a lab. All of these things we do in the lab can be in the home, can be on our bodies. They're showing up there. Here's, you know, for example, when we were looking at benefits of HDR content on a user, we were able to show quite easily that people were more engaged under HDR viewing conditions. Often we use, one of the signals that is often used is what's called a P300 response, and the 300 corresponds to a certain oscillation in a neural electroencephalogram response. But what you're looking for is that people, when they're more engaged, you want to see lower responses, because the P300 is notorious for representing, you know, change. I detected something new that I hadn't been experiencing before. So when people are more engaged in the information, you don't typically see a strong P300, and that shows up in different places. But we use EEG a lot to be able to, or people on my team will, to be able to identify engagement and whether people are tracking different content. But here's the thing. So that was captured in a lab with a typical EEG. Here's some data using just a single channel EEG, where now you can capture, I wonder if you realize, one of the things I'm particularly excited about is where the amount of information we can capture in an ear. I envision a future not too far off where we actually wear sensors in our ears to listen to our bodies in order to drive our devices, to drive our content. Just with sensors just in an ear, we can capture heart rate, blood oxygen level. We can capture single channel EEG. In this case, this is single channel EEG indicating spatial attention, meaning I'm looking straight ahead, but I'm thinking about something over there, and we can know that. I can also know which talker I'm trying to pick up in a noisy cocktail setting where I have multiple talkers overlapped, and I'm only wanting to try to hear Meryl sitting there, who maybe will talk to me, but I don't know. So But the point is that the differentiation of these signals, that 3 years ago, I'd say, it's going to stay in the lab. It's starting to, because of the sophistication that we're seeing with development of machine learning in silicon, is becoming a realizable thing to start getting into the environment and on body. So we can also, in the ear, pick up the electrooculogram of where you're looking. The electrical change between the front and back of your retina. If your eye gaze moves, you can record that in the ear. People are starting to be able to do vagal nerve stimulation in the ear. Might not think that matters. Well, guess what? That's a critical component of reducing stress, driving neuroplasticity for reduction of PTSD or reduction of tinnitus, something I actually do care dearly about. So you start to become realizing that there are these points of intersection to our bodies, and how we think about that closed loop interaction with our technology, whether it's optimizing our bodies or optimizing how we experience the information around us, is going to become a critical part of our future, whether you want it to or not. You have to at least be open to knowing what's happening out there. Now, just in the dynamics of our voices, when I say dynamics, I mean the statistical properties of how we speak, not what we speak, but how we speak, tell us a great deal about our mental and physical health. Groups have been able to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to look at the statistical distributions of semantic coherence, syntactical complexity, to predict with like over 90% accuracy whether someone will develop a psychosis in 5 years, just from their speech. In some cases, you see linguistic changes with Alzheimer's that can show up sometimes 10 years before clinical diagnosis, that can be captured in in statistical analysis of your speech. Dementia, multiple sclerosis, bipolar, diabetes. The spectral coloration of your voice changes in ways that we aren't sensitive to, but an algorithm can be and is. Heart disease. There's aeration that can show up in how people speak that's detectable computationally to predict heart disease. I mean, these are all papers that exist scientifically. And you start to realize, this one I think is kind of funny, but some psychologists have looked at, again, it's not what people say, it's how they say it, but looking at a computational analysis of dialogue interactions between couples can in some case predict whether they're actually going to stay together and exactly when they won't. But I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But I do think we have to realize, this is a place where devices will know more about us than we do. And that's going to become the places where we consume content. It's going to become our spaces. I'd say that the capacity for devices to already know more about us than we do in certain settings is already there. Now, if I think about where we already have smart devices in our homes that capture our voices, capture how we are speaking, this can sound it sounds very Big Brother, it can sound scary. But this is worth solving these problems. This is democratizing health diagnosis. This is enabling people who don't even know that they should see a doctor or that they might have a condition or even what that condition is to get treatment. This is enabling treatment 10 years before you otherwise would, where you might actually make a difference, right? This is also empowered aging. This type of computation is enabling people to stay in their homes instead of end up in facilities that eat up their entire retirement. We have to solve these problems because as humans, we're really good at integrating when things go wrong. And when I say that, we're really good at not noticing differences and things that might make us ineffective at doing the day-to-day things that we need to do. But a trusted computational assessment of, say, our language that's personalized to our content will know these differences, will be able to identify them. And I think that's a critical way. I often talk about this with regard to hearing loss. Has anyone ever heard of an acoustic neuroma? So an acoustic neuroma is a benign tumor that starts on the vestibular nerve, progresses to the auditory nerve. It's benign, but the point is that it grows rapidly. And I've known 5 people that's a really high percentage, just so you know, but I'm sure it's actually higher because people don't notice they have it. I've known 5 people with acoustic neuromas who had them, and they didn't even go to an audiologist or see a medical practitioner until they had maybe 40, 50 dB hearing loss. And in 2 of those cases, they were auditory scientists. It's because our systems are so good at integrating things that happen gradually. And it's not until it's quite extreme that you really realize that there's something wrong. And one, I'd like to destigmatize how we actually capture and track our hearing loss, but if you imagine an algorithm would never get that. An algorithm would have noticed it at 3 dB. I mean, an algorithm would have noticed it really quickly where, one, that tumor wouldn't have progressed to the auditory nerve potentially. It would have been only on the vestibular nerve. It would have enabled someone to get help to identify. It's just the ramifications of doing this right are so huge to me that it's something we have to really think about. Now, this is, so I'm talking about ways we talk, ways we feel. We actually, how many people are aware that your voice, the chemical composition of your breath actually gives away how you're feeling? Yes, my head looks like, there's a dynamic interaction of carbon dioxide, acetone, and isoprene in your breath that change when your heart speeds up, when your muscles tense, and all without any particular obvious change in your overt behavior. So we were actually, I spoke at a TED this year, and we actually measured in the audience. You might appreciate this because you are content people who appreciate content. I had a sort of horror movie. It was A Woman in Black, and there's a scene where there's many scenes in that movie where I will scream or feel extreme suspense, and we actually had tubes throughout the entire audience that were capturing carbon dioxide. CO2 is heavier than the air, so you can have it down on the ground, and they were measuring the density, the real-time density of CO2. And so we were able to I was able to scare the audience and see a fear response in the carbon dioxide in real time with a 20-second delay. But then also I took the same thing and had a different soundtrack that was really actually pretty campy overlaid on it, and you would see a different emotional response that could be captured in the CO2. Okay, so the point is we broadcast this chemical signature of our emotions. And there's already consumer devices that are measuring these things because people realize this. So this is a piece of work I thought was kind of fun. This is looking at, and this is a different group did this. It was interesting though. So they were capturing multiple audiences across different times, watching Hunger Games. And this just happens to be the CO2 response, but you can tell if you zoom in, you can actually see in each audience, obviously you see a similar trajectory of CO2. That's great repeatability across the entirely heterogeneous subject groups, but you see, you can see exactly where Katniss's dress catches on fire during Hunger Games, which I'm sure you've all seen many times, right? But in emotion tracking, we've gotten very, very good at this, where it's not just about the overt emotions we might capture through computational machine learning algorithms, but now it's gone to the next stage where AI and machine learning can tell not just what emotion you're trying to exude, but whether it's genuine, whether it's real, whether my smile is real or fake. That degree of authenticity is unparalleled, but I think a critical component to, say, human wellness. So you want to have an empowered aging system where you're capturing information about someone to know how they really authentically are doing in an environment. And that sophistication to know what's real and what isn't becomes an important piece. Now, sorry, we have a little bit of time left, I think, and so I'm going to tell a couple of interesting stories. I mean, this is something I'm particularly interested in the future. And again, this is less my Dolby side, more my side of thinking about things that might sound a little crazy, but not crazy. But I didn't use that word. So before I joined Dolby, I've studied many species. I think about the world and technology as it evolves us. We will be different people, different humans in 5 years, in 10 years, and we have to accept that. We're not going to be the same. And how we shape our technology is in our power, and it's a critical part of how we evolve in different ways. So one of my way of thinking that way has come from working with many different species across my career. I spent many of my years working with marmosets in the past, so I was a primate physiologist at one point. And Marmosets are really interesting because they're native to Brazil and native to the Amazon rainforest. What happens when you have to have these critical, I've got to eat, I've got to mate, I've got to communicate, and I can't see anyone. What do I do about it? I'm in dense foliage, I'm in a tree. What happens is that my visual, when one sense is sort of compromised on the amount of information it can transmit, then the other senses sort of augment and get enhanced. And so marmosets actually have amazing vocalizations, a lot like birdsong, which is pretty cool for a primate, but then they also have this system of communicating through pheromones that is quite extensive. So I've worked with these species for a long time, not for some time now, but they're very social, they're very communal, and the dominant female in a colony will secrete pheromones so that the ovulation of all the other females in the colony is suppressed. So this is her mental state and her role in that social group, controlling what happens biologically through chemical signaling on all these other primates, which is pretty crazy. And you can take then one female out, put her in the same proximity, but now with a different mental state, a different role, and she'll start ovulating almost right away. So this gets at something that I do believe in, which is how we experience content and emotional experiences as a group is a really powerful part of being human. And we have, human pheromones, we haven't found necessary signatures or even that they're relevant, but at the same time, I think we all do believe there are deterministic biological signals that we share and that are enhanced when we're consuming content together or we're in emotional experiences. I like to say this is, understanding why a cinema experience is so impactful, or why we go to live concerts instead of watching a perfect reconstruction by ourselves alone. And one of the things that there's just some data that we looked at recently. I can't show these for reasons that rights reasons right now, but so we used some examples of highly emotional content. This happened to be points in Mad Max. One of them was a big build-up chase to an explosion. Another, this particular scene, she's driving along and someone grabs her throat, and it's very emotional. But then we were looking at what the neural coherence, what happens to people when they are experiencing these alone, in terms of, do people have similar reactions when they're watching this content by themselves and engaged? They're all engaged, no overt behaviors. They're instructed not to do that. But versus when they're simply in the same space together in a social setting. And one of the things that happens is, so the two really emotional points, and you get this synchrony in neural coherence. So this is just looking at the coherence of their neural signals, of their EEGs, their EEG in electroencephalogram in response to this emotional content. And the blue represents 3 individuals that were in different, watch the content, same setting, same room, but not together, versus consuming it together. And this is something that's really impacted when we consume information together, is how our brains synchronize, how we get amplification of those emotional responses. And I'm sort of excited that we want to always think about these things, because it is at the core of the things that differentiate our experiences in many cases. In places like Stanford are moving to even capture, I'm talking about chemical signaling or these biological signals we give off, but at Stanford they've been able to show, a patch that can measure glucocorticoids. That's responses to chronic stress, things that can predict, Parkinson's, or you want to capture these easily, but it's not such a far future that human chemistry and social interaction will advance in ways that we will understand it in a quite sophisticated manner. And the last sort of, this isn't the end, I've got a little bit left, but I just want you to realize that, so I've taken you through a few of the different ways that we pick up information and we give off information about our bodies that are going to become part of a future that I think is going to be quite ubiquitous. But even understanding the sophistication of how we experience content, it's become quite mainstream. So here's an example of a way that we might do what's called more neural marketing, or understand the adjectives that people experience with content or with a particular technology. Someone here is sitting watching different adjectives that might be descriptors of something. In this case, it had to do with HDR content. And you're trying to pull out, what do they really experience when they watch that content? Because we can think they experience a lot of things, but can we actually know that objectively. And so what you would do is you might show this list of adjectives associated with some rich experience, then they watch the content, and afterwards you can actually, again, we're looking at this P300 response in this case because you're looking for the adjectives that showed the least amount of change, because those are the ones that were most associated with what they just consumed. And you can see, really predictable changes in enjoyable, excited, color, texture, and you can also get at many different descriptors that you might want to pull out. These things are very this is almost operational. This is quite operationalized in how these things work, and it's actually, we do these things on our own, but this type of neural marketing, understanding internal state and experience to drive decision making isn't new. This is everywhere. You've got it driving advertising, shopping, media, product, and content. The ability to predict and anticipate what people experience we understand that pretty well in different ways. And there's been a number, Nielsen has done a great amount of work, but a number of ways to show that understanding emotional valence and the impact of it and what these, how people actually, their internal state responds is a key contributor to driving retention, driving subscriptions, optimizing advertising spots, how you spend that time and money to engage your viewers, as well as your brand favorability. And these are all key metrics that most of us care about. So I like to say it's the end of the poker face, and I'm sorry if that's, this is really where we're at. But the real thing is it's also the era of the empath. And we're going to have closed loop technology that enables us to better understand internal state experiences. I think it's a great way where we're going to democratize the benefits that our technology bring to everyone across different demographics. And that's why I believe in it so strongly is, when we build a technology or we create an experience, we want to know that that is as rich and as consistent and robust as possible across everyone that touches that technology and consumes that content. And this is the way to get there. So, we have to understand the probabilistic nature of what I call our perceptual realities. We want to enable device convergence and closed loop sensing. We want to embrace our personalization and contextual optimization. Sorry, I have my words I used to say. Tackle privacy issues with, I'll decode them if I need to. But privacy issues with awareness and insight are really critical because consumers have to trust what you're doing, and that's broken right now. I think it's a really, I like to say that there's a big shift happening. So there's a meme that's popular, but I use it sometimes to talk about the same revolution I think is happening right now, going to happen with how we intersect with our devices and technology. If you look, in 1997, what was the mantra that any good parent would say to their kids? It was, don't get in cars with strangers, don't talk to people on the internet, right? So fast forward to 2017, literally summon strangers from the internet to climb into your car, right? That's a big shift that's a big shift that's happened in where we are, in what we believe, what we trust, how we think about, our criterion for risk and engagement. But it's happened with a big foundation. It's also happened because we care about convenience and accessibility, and that always trumps rational thought sometimes. But we know it's going to happen. I think something similar is happening with how we think about, how we engage with technology and enable technology to engage with us. All the personalization that we care about is there. So I want to end with a quick cycle of what I call creation, and where this is showing, thinking about these new dimensions and how we get there and where it's relevant can help us and drive to new tools and new capacity. So our understanding, always what we're trying to achieve, it starts with great artists. I believe that, and I believe that great artists have an understanding as a neuroscientist of human experience. They use different dialogue than I might use. They describe things differently, but they innately understand human experience in ways that are much more sophisticated than probably any scientist. And I always try to appreciate that. So Rembrandt, for instance, again, is someone who didn't actually have good stereoscopic vision. He had one of his eyes pointed out slightly, and so it was difficult for his brain to integrate integrate binocular cues, but he became an expert then in representing depth and shading in different ways on a two-dimensional page. And you go from this amazing artistry where then scientists try to understand theoretically what they already are creating. And I call this stage of theoretical description for underlying principles. We have an example here is, it's not quantitative as much as it's descriptive, where something like an Adelson grid, we are understanding the impact of information in our environment on our experience of texture and shading. Many of you probably know this. A and B are the same luminance, right? They're actually the same, and it's your brain trying to make sense of shadows. If I take away the impact of that cylinder, obviously you can now see A and B are the same. I can control your experience of the world by changing the opacity of that mask. But you go back and forth. This is studying illusions like this or developing theories for how our brain works is a great component, but things become much more powerful when we can quantify that and make predictions about why it works. That's where I spent a lot of time before I went into the technology space, was trying to understand not how it works, the fact that it does work this way, but what's happening in that coding transformation that we can make those predictions for why it works, and we get there, and then that can enable algorithmic development. And in the case of compression algorithms that have driven much of audio coding, whether it was MP3 or Dolby Digital or any AC4 or any of our other MPEG-H, any of these others, they're all driven by an understanding of the perceptual transformations, and frankly have computational neural models of the auditory pathway in how they are developed. And that was a critical part, but that's starting to happen now, and how we have to think much more. We can't just stop at the auditory periphery. We have to actually include what happens in the rest of the brain going forward, and we can. Now, you go from here, and we get to those enable us to make different tools, something like Dolby Vision enabling high dynamic range development, but it's really, this is where things become, to me, quite critical. It's the standardization of these technologies that allow us to actually assure that this transmission and the right capture is showing up, operationally effectively across the world. And once you get to that stage, that's when we get to do what I consider to be very exciting, which is, have a baby. Which is exciting, but which we can do that is very exciting, which is create tools for new creators and create new tools for the artists of the future to engage differently than they have in the past, which is I think should be all of our goals. And we go from here. So I had a great, for Dolby Vision, that's the company I'm with, so I get to talk about that. But one of our first cinematic release with Dolby Vision was Inside Out. And I loved the conversation I had with the head scientist from that led that effort, because I really wanted to understand just how did the technology enable your creators to think differently about what they were doing, about the content, what was different. Because if they don't do anything differently, or they don't use it differently, what's the point of building it, right? Like, at least, I mean, maybe it's more efficient, but obviously if you're really trying to transform something, I think we all are in different ways, you want to assure that it's actually enabling a different future that's richer and better. And so one of the things he said that I loved was, he said, well, one of my favorite parts was when the baby was born in Inside Out, there's this really diffuse white specular field. He's like, and if you've ever seen it, it's almost, you feel it, right? And he's like, my creators wanted people to feel pain. I'm like, okay. And he's like, well, a baby's coming out of this very enclosed, dark space into this really bright environment. And it is physiologically jarring. It's a really aggressive stimulus. And they wanted that to be felt by the audience. And to me, that was a transformative moment, because here technology has enabled an artist to think in a dimension that they previously wouldn't have gone to. It's one thing to hope, to create a storyline. It's another to have a physiological expectation of what your audience how they might experience that content. And I thought that was extremely powerful in where we want to go. And then other things that happened in Inside Out with the capacity and enabled by BT 2020, you've got differentiation between reality and when you're in her head and with all the emotions, and that's differentiated between how the color space is used, because 2020 is only you're only going into those expansions when you're in her head with all the other emotions, which to me is where we want to go. Then we're creating new tools to fill that cycle, close the loop. And ultimately, we will modify our brains in different ways when we intersect with technology in these different directions. So my close to you is 2 things. One, are we ready for our new creators? Because they will be thinking differently, they will be behaving differently, and how should our technology react? Devices will know more about us in our environments than we do, and our technology will be tied more and more to our internal experiences. Now, these are things of the future, but some of these can happen right now. Something like how we control dialogue enhancement. It's quite a realistic problem that we're already thinking about. So this is Leo Tolstoy, and this is my last thought to you, which I love. So, well, not my thought, but I like what he has to say. But Leo Tolstoy wrote an essay, a theoretical, philosophical essay on what is art. Okay, and if you've ever read it, it's a lot of philosophical musings that are unique to him. But one of the things that he believes with regard to what art is that it's only realized when the intent of the creator is experienced by the receiver on the other side. You can talk to a lot of artists who are more interested in the heterogeneity of how people think about their art. But for Leo, it was all about that connection. Today's creators can know that. Our technology now can include that. So for all of Leo Tolstoy's philosophical musings, that's actually a realized, objectionable state that can happen today. Knowing these things, knowing what we will know, how we will intersect with our technology, there's no question it's going to change how we tell our stories as content creators and just to each other, frankly, what we expect of our technology. I mean, your consumers will have a different perspective on how their technology will behave and how it should actually perform and enable them to have a good experience than they do today. That will be different in 5 years. Whether you implement it or not, other technologies will be, which will up how they think about efficacy and success of their experiences in technology. So we need to think about it because it's going to happen. So thank you.